international economics and politics from Belgrade, and Professor Jankovic from the Institute of International Politics and Economy will be hosting actually today's meeting. I will just briefly introduce what was the idea, and to say that first we also have to thank to our colleague Vladimir Rusić, who is today also one of the presenters, but actually who initiated in a way this kind of debate, actually reminding us about this important anniversary, and that he will be first introducing us to the different phases with the maps and the different ideas that we had at the table during these 4 or 5 years, let me say, in a way, of the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina 25 to 30 years ago. So he will remind us about how everything was going on. And after that, we will have several very competitive witnesses and analysts of the whole process. With us already is Professor Timoti Les, who is working at the Cambridge University. Slobo will more precisely present all of the participants, but what I wanted to stress out in a way how we perceive Professor Les as somebody who is, let me say, defending or still presenting some ideas that mostly David Owen was pushing and seeing as the way of finishing the whole turmoil at the Balkans. Then again, we will have hopefully Ambassador Peter Galbрајт, who was with us also several months ago. So he joined us as Vlada is showing. I think.
Sorry, Misha, for interruption. I just contacted Peter, and he said he's sitting 15 minutes on a link. So I'm asking Slobodan if he can resend a link or do something with that link to Peter's email again, if possible. Yeah.
I've sent it as well, you know, so he should press it out and join us, you know, but I think that he will join with us as well. But what I wanted is to remind us that actually it was 4 months ago when we were commemorating 25 years of the storm operation in Oluja. We had the privilege really of Professor Galbрајt and Ambassador Galbрајt being with us. And I want to thank him that he is again with us, because as we all know, he played very important role in the whole process of the finishing of the war in Bosnia and in Croatia in the way it was finished, and also contributed to the drafting and implementing in a way Dayton Peace Accord. And finally, last but not least, of course, we have Professor Srđan Trivković. Of course, I have first to excuse former Minister of Foreign Affairs of for Federal Republic of Yugoslavia and Serbia, Vladislav Jovanović, who was supposed to be with us, but due to the really catastrophic numbers of COVID in Belgrade and in Serbia, he really insisted that he got a veto from his wife and that he can't move out, and he unfortunately couldn't prepare all the technical facilities. So we don't have him with us, but we have also somebody who was deeply involved in many things happening during the war. Srđan will correct me, Professor Srđan Trivković, who at the time, I think at some point was also official advisor to the President of Republika Srpska, if I'm correct. But he was definitely many times at Pale and following the whole crisis, writing on that and so on. And even now, he is not still commentator of the Chronicles of the International Affairs in the very well-known magazine Chronicles, but also, here is Peter. Hello, nice to see you again. Welcome. Just unmute, Peter.
Yeah, very nice to see you. I apologize, but I was on the link and nothing happened.
Okay, now it's everything as it should be. And I'm just finishing with a basic introduction. I mentioned that we had the privilege really of you and Mr. Les being with us, and Mr. Rusиć, who will introduce us into the phases of the crisis and the maps and so on. And finally, with Professor Srđan Trivković, who is nowadays also professor in Banja Luka, and who is, as I heard from him, mostly interested in the future of the Dayton Peace Accord and the Republika Srpska in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Bosnia generally, and the Balkans concerning the changes that are almost, let me say, happening or in the American administration nowadays. Without further ado, sorry for taking more time than is necessary, and I pass the floor to our colleague Korać, and then to Professor Janković, who will lead the whole discussion. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Misha. Good afternoon on the behalf of the Institute of International Politics and Economics. And let me convey warm greetings from our director, Dr. Branislav Đorđević, who unfortunately couldn't manage to join us today. At the very beginning, I hope you all are doing well in the midst of this never-ending pandemic craze sparked by coronavirus. And it is always a great deal of pleasure to have speakers who are not only esteemed international scholars and academicians, but they also were involved in the making, or at least in implementation, of foreign policies that harshly affected and still do the Balkan politics. In 7 decades long history of the Institute, the Balkan politics, and particularly the neighboring countries, have been among major research topics. Of course, in the aftermath of the breakup of Yugoslavia, the power dynamics in the neighborhood had changed substantially, and the focus of the Institute's research shifted primarily towards the countries of the former Yugoslavia. And when we decided to establish the Center for Neighboring Mediterranean Countries 3 years ago, the main idea was to unleash creative potentials of our researchers to analyze how the Serbian neighborhood policy is to be redesigned as to tackle more effectively the regional problems and to identify plausible avenues for future cooperation in the region. And the Center has produced a bunch of edited volumes and monographs contributing to debates on the current state of the Balkan affairs, and it has organized 12 roundtables, panel discussions, and guest lectures as well. However, I'm absolutely delighted that today's panel discussion is co-organized with the Institute of European Studies, which is one of my favorite research organizations in Serbia. And all credits for today's event go to Dr. Misha Đurković and his associates, as well as to my fellow colleague, Dr. Slobodan Janković, who has been leading the Center for Neighboring and Mediterranean Countries from its very inception. And I wish you pleasant and fruitful debates, although I, however, anticipate it might evolve in a sort of intellectual bloodbath, pardon me for harsh phrasing. Take care of yourself and each other. Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you, Srđan. Well, I won't take much more of your time. Thank you again all for participating, and special thanks to our speakers. We here have now people from 3 continents, from Europe, Asia, and North America. I hope we'll have a fruitful discussion after we shall hear our speakers. First, we'll have Vladimir Rusиć, who will get us familiar or remind us with his maps on what were the proposals, peace proposals, and how the war in Bosnia should be settled. Afterward, we will hear from Ambassador Peter Galbрајt, who was part of the US diplomacy at the time of the Dayton Agreement and at the time of the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We will hear also from Professor Srđan Trivković, who is a professor of geopolitics at the Banja Luka University, and is also editor of foreign affairs at Chronicles magazine of the Charlemagne Institute, and he is both British and a US scholar. And we will hear also from Dr. Timothy Less, who is heading European disintegration studies at the Center for Geopolitics of the Cambridge University. So I welcome you all. Thank you all for participating, and we will have some 10 minutes for Dr. Rusиć, and afterward around 15 minutes for each of three speakers. After that, we shall start with the debate. Please, you can raise your hand. You have option raise hand or write in a chat. Maybe it is even better that you have some question, and then I will let you in to comment or to ask question. But if you have comments, please don't make them long. Up to 2 minutes, please. Thank you. So, Dr. Rusиć, please, you can start with the next.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to being today with you, with all of you. Some of you I know, some of you I don't, but it's still a pleasure. And I will not go deeply into the details of the presentation, because as you already explained, the concept of this webinar is that we pay more attention to this to the discussion.
Sorry, I forgot to say something very important. We are recording this event. And afterward, if all speakers are okay, then we could put it also on some platform.
Thank you very much. Let me just do technical part to try to share the screen. Sorry, host disabled participants screen sharing. So since you are the host, can you please run the presentation? Slobodan, you're muted. We cannot hear you. You're muted. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. My presentation is actually a quick overview of the history of Bosnia and Herzegovina right before the Dayton Agreement. So we are not going deeply into the history of Bosnia and Herzegovina from the 15th century or 10th century. So the first slide, the first map you see is a very familiar map. This is basically a map which shows ethnic distribution in Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1991, before war started in Bosnia. Basically, this census from 1991 has never been verified in the parliament, because state of Yugoslavia broke up after that. But anyway, these census data are more or less correct, and you can see the distribution of the three major ethnicities in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which more or less corresponds with the historical distribution of ethnicities. Of course, the numbers are different because of the impact of the Second World War and a lot of victims which happens in Bosnia, especially against the Orthodox population during the Nazi puppet state in the independent state of Croatia. But the territorial distribution is more or less the same. Blue colors presents the Serbs, green colors presents the Bosniaks, and the orange color presents Croats. We can move to the next slide. On the next slide, we can see basically a peace plan drafted by José Cotillero and also supported by Lord Carrington. So that was the first version of the Cotillero's plans, which was actually before the war started in Bosnia and Herzegovina. As you can see, red color represents Serbs, blue color Croats, and the green color Bosniaks. The thing is that this map was basically in line with municipal borders within Bosnia-Herzegovina, and you can see that there is no territorial connections between different regions, for example, which were meant to be Serb-held cantons or Bosniak-held cantons or Croat-held cantons. However, this map is before the war, which means that freedom of movement and zero atrocities were there. So this map was sustainable in a way that everyone could travel and function normally. This plan was basically accepted by all three sides. Later on, Mr. Izetbegović, who was the chair of the presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina at that time, he rejected this plan 4 days after. There is an allegation that he did it after some conversation with at that time American ambassador Zimmerman, but also academic Muhamed Filipović, Bosniak academic, when he was asked in several interviews after the war, what was the reason Mr. Izetbegović rejected this plan afterwards? He said, I asked Mr. Izetbegović several times, he never gave me a response. So it still remains a secret why he rejected, although there are a lot of rumors what can be a reason, but let's talk about that later. Can we move to the next slide? This was Putiliero's peace plan map second version. As you can see, it's more adjusted to the settlements than to the municipal borders in order to better reflect ethnic territorial distribution of ethnicities. The white line, which you see, presents today's inter-ethnic entity borderline. So you can see how this map corresponds to the today's map. What is the difference and what is the similarities between second version of Putiliero's peace plan and the Dayton agreement. We can move to the third map. The third map shows Vance-Owen peace plan by division of Bosnia and Herzegovina into 10 cantons. And as you can see, a red line again represents Serbs, Croats are shown in blue line, and Bosniaks in green line. There is no territorial connections between different provinces held by Serbs, nor the two provinces held by Croats. However, this map was basically first adopted and then rejected by the Bosnian Serb leadership because of a lack of territorial connections between the cantons and some constitutional proposals. When you look into this map, you can, for example, see that Croatian-held cantons are actually on territorial connections with the Republic of Croatia. So for them, that would not be a problem to make communication between their cantons through Croatia, while in the case of Serbian cantons, they were divided into four or five pieces. Also, the Bosnian cantons were divided. Northwest Bosnia was at that time operating autonomous autonomous province of Western Bosnia, which was not in, let's say, good relations with the central Bosniak authorities in Sarajevo. We can move to the next slide. On next slide, this map is Owen-Stoltenberg peace plan map. And basically, we can see the union of three republics: Republika Srpska, Republic of Bosnia, with the majority of Bosniaks shown in green, and so-called Republic of Herceg-Bosnia shown in orange color. As you can see here, there is a concept of not of cantons, but of union of three republics. This map was accepted by Bosnian Serb leadership. It was accepted by Bosnian Croat leadership, but not accepted by Bosniak leadership. On this map, territorial distribution is like this: 54% of territories were Republika Srpska, 30% of territory Bosniak Republic or Republic of Bosnia, and the rest Herceg Bosnia. Those purple zones are Sarajevo district, which is supposed to be under rule of UN in transitional period, and Mostar city, which is supposed to be under the European Community or European Union management in transitional period. We can move to the next slide. On the next slide, we see basically the proposal from a contact group. This proposal, according to my research, was some kind of basically low-profile proposal. There was not much attention paid to this proposal. Basically, it passed somehow not very noticed like the previous proposals. However, this proposal was not basically acceptable to the Serb side because of a lot of fragmentation of the Republika Srpska. However, even on this map, Republika Srpska has some kind of territorial connections, although very tiny. But all industrial places and all big and major cities basically were delivered to the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina at that time. And on this map, green color represents Croat Bosniak Federation, and the blue color represents Republika Srpska. After failure of acceptance of this basically plan and map, which was also based on two-entity model, 49/51% of the territory for each of the entities, and again the same arrangement for Sarajevo district and Mostar district, like on the previous map. The war continued, unfortunately. In the meantime, self-proclaimed Republic of Serb Krajina disappeared from the map due to Operation Storm, and then we moved to the making arrangements for the Dayton Agreement. Can we move to the next slide? Yes. This slide and map shows basically, the big map shows Bosnia and Herzegovina as it today, but with ethnic distribution from 1991. So with this orange color, the Serbs are shown in orange color. This green color represents Bosniaks, and purple color Croats. On the smaller twin map on the left side, you can see basically the distribution of the territories who hold the what before the Dayton Agreement. So who give up from which territories in order to make the map which we know today. And also we have on this small map, we can see three different zones covered by S4. At the beginning, it was I4, international forces, to keep peace, which original mandate was designed for 2 years, but of course they stayed longer because of the need. We can move to the next slide. Okay, this is the same, but now just showing administrative division also in Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. We can see 10 cantons there, and just one small note why the administration in Bosnia and Herzegovina is complicated and complex. It's because actually Bosnia and Herzegovina now has, let's say, 14 governments. One is the state government, then we have 2 entity governments, then we have 10 canton governments, and we had 1 government of the Brčko district, which makes altogether 14 administration cabinets. So when we are talking about making more basically simplified structure of the Bosnia and Herzegovina, my point would be that the focus should be on federation, because they have 10 governments plus entity government, which is 11, which shows asymmetric structure of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And my last slide, next one, yes, it is just a quick overview about the key points which I basically extracted from the whole this situation. As we can see that, and we know that the civil war was almost 4 years. Then over 2 million of displaced persons, not only in Bosnia, but majority of them outside of Bosnia, including Canada, Germany, Scandinavian countries, Australia, and so on. Around 100,000 killed in total on all 3 sides, damage infrastructure and economy. So-called brain drain and the population, which is very important to mention in terms of capacity of state to restore itself. Semi-protectorate instead of self-sustainability. This is directly connected to the next bullet point, which is political tensions instead of tripartite cooperation, which means that mechanisms of Dayton Accord are not utilized properly. If you ask me, I think the Dayton Accord is a very good one and a very good how to say, basis for cooperation. However, everything can be twisted in a negative way if you want to do so. So instead of using the mechanism of Dayton occurred as keeping a balance between three ethnicities and between the concept of ethnic state and civic state, politicians unfortunately are not using that properly. And just basically to mention the last two bullet points, wake, future, and perspectives in terms of EU accession and basically future of the country. And what I would like to make as some kind of positive note at the bottom of this slide is ethnic distance decreased due to mentality of the people, which means that I don't see that basically politicians contributed a lot to making ethnic distance and basically misunderstandings between three ethnicities, but it's more like due to mentality of people. When I say so, I'm always have a comparison in my head, for example, how things are not very positive even today between Serbs and Croats, for example, or Serbs and Albanians. We still have a very big ethnic distance between those two categories in Bosnia, probably due to history of Bosnia and history of basically multi-ethnic relations. This ethnic distance is decreased, not of course decreased to zero, but decreased in a higher percentage that it was decreased between Serbs and Albanians, or Serbs and Croats, or Croats and Bosniaks today in Federation of Bosnia-Herzegovina. And that would be the last slide from my side. Thank you for attention, and I hope I squeezed it into the 10 minutes.
Well, a couple of minutes more. Okay, thank you very much for these slides, these informations. And now we should hear first Ambassador Peter Galbрајт, then Dr. Timoти Less, and finally Professor Srđa Trivković on history and perspectives of the 25th anniversary of Dayton Agreement. And before we start, I would just like to remind you, speaking of the perspectives, that now we have in recent days proliferation of articles in European Union on how Joe Biden, if he will swear on 20th of January as a new president, how this is a new opportunity to change the constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina, essentially to change the Dayton Agreement, and to make as people who are writing articles at Deutsche Welle, for example, or European Council for Foreign Relations, make Bosnia a functional state. So I hope that we shall hear something also about this. And please, Ambassador Галбрајт, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me clearly. Okay. So my presentation is almost entirely historical. I served nearly 5 years in the Balkans, so I was by far the longest serving US diplomat. But since then, I've moved on to other issues. So I'm not going to spend very much time on what the future might be, but I think it might be helpful to have some perspective on how we got here. One of the problems with the international community as it looks at Dayton is that it's almost all virgin birth. So people tend to focus from the moment they got there, when in fact there's a much longer history. And I really appreciated seeing your maps, and I'm glad you started in 1991, because in so many of my encounters with parties, they would begin a lot sooner. The worst, I think, was meeting Milan Martic, who began in his presentation with the words, "in the year 600." But anyhow, what is the significance of Dayton looking back 25 years? First, I think the important point is that Dayton grew out of a unique moment in international relations. It was the end of the USSR, Europe was not organized to take on challenges. China and India were rising powers, but not in the position that either holds today. And so America's position in the world in the 1990s was unique. And that particularly followed the first Gulf War, when you had this spectacular display of American military prowess and technology. To some degree, in the 1990s, we were the arbiters of the world. And in that sense, it was a terrific time to be a diplomat. The second point I'd make, and I might just contrast with the European effort. They said, we'll handle it. But when you went to the warring parties, when you had a troika that consisted of Portugal, Netherlands, and Luxembourg, this was not going to impress people like Franjo Tudjman. The second point I would make is that Dayton, again, it was not virgin birth, yes, and it was not primarily a product of brilliant diplomacy, although I think it was a very well-organized negotiation. It really, we got there in a trajectory of actions that began in 1993 and continued up through Dayton. 1993, President Clinton took office. And in the very initial period, a great deal of the focus was on Croatia, and particularly the Croat atrocities that were taking place against the Bosniaks. And so there was a process which was aimed at ending what was then called the Muslim Croat War. First, getting prisoners released, and ultimately leading to the Washington Agreement. At that time, U.S. influence in Croatia was enormous. So none of the Tudjman or any of the Croatian diplomats, they never argued with what we were demanding. They would simply apologize for what they couldn't achieve. And in the end, they made some critical decisions. One of them was to get rid of Mati Boban, and replace him with Perlic. And ultimately, you came to what was a military alliance of the Croatia, the government of Bosnia-Herzegovina, and the Bosnian Croats, that in a relatively short period of time shifted the military balance. And part of it is an action which President Izetbegović and Alija Izetbegović told me in 2000 was the most important thing that we did, which was not to object to violations of the arms embargo by Croatia and Bosnia. Of course, Croatia and Serbia were already violating the arms embargo. A lot was made of the fact that some of the weapons came from Iran, but most of them did not come from Iran. They came from elsewhere. And again, over time, that shifted the balance. I also want to say, because it's so often argued that the US violated the arms embargo. No, that's not true. We had no obligation. We obeyed the arms embargo on ourselves, but we had no obligation to enforce it on others. And that's what we didn't do. And I know everybody loves to talk about MPRI as if the Croatians needed a handful of retired generals to really win a military victory. I mean, it was good publicity for their company, but it just wasn't the reality. What made Dayton possible was Operation Storm. And here the US role was key, because we chose not to object. If we had, it almost certainly would not have gone forward, as indeed an earlier Croatian request in November of '94 we did object to. Now, again, since when Americans talk about these things, it's always about America, those accounts like Holbrooke's always talk about the NATO bombing. But in fact, I think that was less important, although it had a big psychological impact. And fundamentally, it was much easier for the Serbs to accept a 49-51 division when what they held on the ground was 45% than it was when they held 70%. Now, you could argue that they would have been much better off simply choosing the 21% to give up. But that's always politically difficult to give up any territory that's yours. A next point I want to make is about why did the U.S. choose to get involved in the first place. I mean, this is a part of that basically had no strategic interest to the United States. And so here too, there's a kind of unique moment. The first is I would talk about what was the CNN effect. And, you know, when people ask me about who might be at the, of course, a lot of people's hope, because she brought it's into everybody's living room. Now with you, other atrocities.
Mr. Galbraith, we have some problem with the sound. I think we're not. I'm not hearing you well. Are others able to hear Mr. Galbraith?
No, no, actually lost. Peter, are you there?
Yeah.
Unmute,
okay.
Unmute.
Okay, is this better?
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yeah, it's
yes,
better.
yes.
Just
Okay.
Last 4 or 5 sentences, actually.
Yeah, we did not hear them.
Okay, did you hear me talking about how it was easier to get the Serbs to accept 49%?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
The
That
next
was the last.
impact was CNN, what we call the CNN effect. And as I said, I often thought that, you know, maybe Holbrooke deserved a Nobel Peace Prize, but perhaps Christiane Amanpour did, because she and the other journalists, not her alone, really brought this war into people's living rooms. At a time when you didn't have YouTube, you weren't looking at what was going on in Yemen and Syria, it was just there. And even though the US had no strategic interest, Bosnia became a metaphor for European weakness and also for US weakness, if you will. I mean, how is it that in the heart of Europe, a city was being shelled and the atrocities that were taking place, you know, World War II type prison camps, and nobody was doing anything about it. And so even though there was no US strategic interest, that was a key factor on the war. And what's striking is how much time the President Clinton spent on Bosnia. Early in his administration, because he was accused of spending too much time on the economy, he said, no, I'm spending about 25% of my time on foreign affairs. And of that 25%, 10% was roughly in different meetings on Bosnia, not always very effective ones, but it was an obsession. Then a further factor in getting to Dayton were the characters. First, the 3 leaders, all of whom have departed: Tudjman, Izetbegović, and Milosevic. Tudjman was an interesting character. I always thought he was a creature out of the 19th century, but he was a very disciplined leader. I mean, again, we're not going to argue about whether you like what he did, but in terms of the quality of his leadership. And so he was very strategic. He was often quite rigid. Izetbegović had the impression of always being under siege. And Milosevic was very tactical, but he was also erratic. And one of the things that we did as part of this process, and again, I'm talking about a process from '93 through Dayton, was to do workarounds. So with Tudjman, when he would get very rigid, we could go to Mate Granic and Gojko Šušak and make the case to them. I know Šušak is not a popular guy with this audience, but the reality is that he had lived in North America, so he understood our mentality. And what was critical, for example, was getting them to eliminate Boban as the leader and to make some changes. Izetbegović had also some stronger leaders. I will name people around him: Haris Saladic, Ayub Ganic, and Mohamed Sačabe. And Milosevic, though, really didn't have the same system around him, but he was somebody who basically marginalized the Bosnian Serbs. Mladic and Karadzic, of course, but then the ones who went to Dayton. And I just have to say another word about Milosevic. I think it's important to understand just how much alcohol played in this whole process, particularly in Dayton. I was at the beginning of Dayton, and then I went to went to do the shuttle over the Eastern Slavonia and came back only at the end. But the first meeting between Milosevic and Tudjman to discuss Eastern Slavonia and Bosnia took place at 4 o'clock at the carriage house in Dayton. And Milosevic showed up 35 minutes late. All right, can you hear me still? He showed up 35 minutes late. He had been drinking at lunch, and then he proceeded to drink a bottle and a half of red wine. I know this because he was the only person drinking red wine. Well, you know, no matter how used you are to that, it inevitably has an impact. And if you read the reports of the American diplomats, they're always talking about the vast amounts of alcohol in meetings with Milosevic, as well as the slaughter of the lambs of Serbia. And finally, there were many turning points. And you know, when you look back at something, you say, oh, well, this result was inevitable. But that isn't necessarily the case, especially if you understand that the United States had no strategic interest, that Bill Clinton wanted to focus on the economy. And it was, there wasn't, in fact, an enormous amount of understanding of the issues. And the US was very reluctant to get involved. So in 1993, because of the atrocities that were being inflicted on the Bosniaks by the Croats, there was a moment when the administration decided, or was considering, not sending an ambassador to Croatia. Now, it wasn't that I was brilliant, but once you made that decision, then it would be impossible to send anybody unless the situation changed dramatically. In the end, because I worked for the committee that did the confirmation, I could get through it very quickly. Secondly, on the arms shipments, the CIA objected to them. You know, if there'd been a stronger CIA director, maybe we would have told the Croatians to not to permit the arms go to Bosnia. Then there was Srebrenica and the particular way it was found out and the impact it had. So, you know, and that in turn informed the decision to give a green light or not to object to Operation Storm. And finally, there were discussions that Holbrooke and I had with Tudjman in October of, late September, October of 1995, leading up to Dayton. Should we tell Tudjman not to take Banja Luka? And it was a very close call. I think both of us were of the view that after how Tudjman and Croatia had behaved during Operation Storm toward the population in Krajina, that we would face a humanitarian disaster. But we also were of the view that maybe this was the best outcome, you know, a total military defeat. We had also said, but it didn't happen for reasons I still don't understand. We explicitly told them to go ahead and take Prijedor and Kozarac. And finally, and this will be truly finally, one of the features of the agreement, which was also true of the Erdut agreement, is you think of a mediator as somebody who is helping the sides reach agreement. But so much of the key provisions of Dayton were ones that the United States inserted into the agreement. For example, on the police, on the right of people to return, and particularly on war crimes, that the parties agreed to, but you presumably would not have been something they would have agreed to if it had just been among themselves. You know, and I guess this also is a result of the pressure of U.S. pressure. Anyhow, it was a unique moment. Inevitably, the U.S. was not going to play that same role in the world as Russia revived, as Europe got more organized, as China rose. But the U.S. preeminent moment was also greatly damaged by an ill-conceived war in Iraq and the incompetent occupation that followed, and of course, over the last 4 years by Donald Trump.
Thank you, Ambassador Galbrecht. Now we shall hear Dr. Timoti Les, and as I see the questions comments are already coming, but we will got with them after Professor Trivković finish his intervention. So, Dr. Les, are you ready? You should unmute yourself. Okay, here we are. Thank you for staying with us again.
I'm going to try and run some slides. So this is the first time I've done this. So
right, please.
With me.
So
can you see slides?
Yes, green light, share screen.
Can you see them yet?
No. Did you press the share screen button?
I did, yeah.
Nothing showed.
So I've got a feeling. So it has thrown up a menu. I'm not sure this is going to work. Have you got the slides I sent you?
Yes, but don't worry, it will work. Just press, and when you have a different windows open, press on the window with your presentation.
Right. What? You're not seeing the slides?
No.
No. Okay, I'm not convinced we're going to get this to work.
Okay. I will then use your. Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Okay, just 1 second.
That was a trial run. That. Okay.
Okay, here we are.
Okay, great. I'll just tell you when to move to the next one. Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this. Slobodan, you asked us to talk on 3 different topics, of which the first was the road to Dayton, but I have nothing to add to Ambassador Galbraith's comments, so I'm going to focus now on the aftermath of Dayton and the development of Bosnia. And I'm sure it'll come as no surprise if I say that the Dayton settlement has failed to satisfy the hopes of those who believed it could be the basis of a viable Bosnian state. I recall my time there at the end of the 2000s, and I've been monitoring the country since. And my impression is very much that the political atmosphere is relentlessly tense, marked by constant provocations, political battles, periodic crises, while at the grassroots level, people generally stick to the safety of their own ethnic communities and regions. In terms of political organization, it seems to me that Bosnia has effectively collapsed from within, in the sense that power lies with the ethnic regions rather than the shared institutions of state. And any decisions the 3 national groups have to make together are worked out informally between the party leaders. And in terms of the socio-economic development, Bosnia is virtually paralyzed. The old patronage system and the antiquated state-owned economy remain intact. Corruption and nepotism are rife, and the people are poor. And as a consequence, large numbers are leaving the country in search of a better life abroad. Okay, next slide. The reasons for this are complicated and highly debated, but I think the one point on which most analysts can agree is that Dayton succeeded in ending the fighting, but it really didn't resolve the war. For the Serbs and the Croats who wanted independence of some kind, Dayton offered too little. And for the Bosniaks who wanted a centralized, unified state, Dayton gave too much. And as a consequence, all 3 groups have continued to pursue their goals by political rather than military means in the years since Dayton was signed, with the result that Bosnia is in a state of perpetual conflict about the political order on the territory of the country. And this conflict is played out in the form of threats, rhetorical attacks, blockades of the political institutions, legal challenges, politically motivated prosecutions, and low-level violence and intimidation. And in these circumstances, Bosnia's economic development is virtually impossible. The political dispute crowds out all other issues, and the elites are under little pressure to reform the economy or end corruption, because the overwhelming concern of voters is the political dispute. Next slide, please. So since the end of the war, Bosnia has passed through a number of distinct phases, dependent on the role adopted by outside powers. And in the immediate aftermath of the war, outsiders limited their role to enforcing the ceasefire rather than building a state, with the result that the Serbs and the Croats could maintain a de facto independence simply by ignoring the provisions of the Dayton Agreement and waiting for outsiders to go away. Next slide. After 1997, the United States and its allies made the strategic decision to stay in Bosnia until the country was self-sustaining, and awarded executive powers to the United Nations High Representative, who tried to enforce compliance with Dayton, drawing on NATO troops as necessary, which led the Serbs to belatedly accept the Dayton Agreement for fear that resistance risked Republika Srpska's abolition. And so too did the Croats, following the crushing of their bid to restore Herzegovina in the year 2000. Next slide, please. So from 2000 until 2005, outsiders then engaged in a coercive campaign to prepare Bosnia for the start of the integration process with the EU by strengthening the central institutions at the expense of the devolved ethnic regions and breaking the stranglehold of Serb nationalists, with the result that by 2005, the Serb elites were psychologically defeated and accepted the international policy that they joined the European Union as part of a unified Bosnia. Next slide, please. After that, the United States more or less bowed out of Bosnia and passed responsibility for maintaining the country to the Europeans, who ended the use of coercion, withdrew their militaries from Bosnia, and instead relied on the soft power enticement of membership of the European Union to try and suppress Serb and Croat nationalism. However, the effect was a steady disintegration of the state, as the Serbs exploited the political thaw to restore the autonomy they had previously lost. And at the same time, the integration process simply never got started, but just became another battleground in the dispute over the political order in Bosnia, which Bosniaks exploited to try and centralize the state, and the Serbs and Croats to increase their autonomy. Next slide, please. And this has largely been the story of the last 15 years, culminating last year in the European Union's rejection of Bosnia's application for membership. Only the third time in the history of the European project this has happened, after rejecting Franco's Spain and Morocco, and Milorad Dodik's threat of a referendum on independence for Republika Srpska in February this year. I mean, formally, Bosnia remains intact, but is in a state of stalemate, defined by the terms of Dayton. the Bosniaks cannot legally abolish the entities or the cantons because the Serbs and Croats oppose this. But at the same time, the Serbs and Croats cannot legally break away because the Bosniaks oppose this. But over the long term, it does seem to me that the Serbs and Croats are slowly winning this contest by default, simply because it's easier for them to break Bosnia just by refusing to cooperate with the central state than it is for the Bosniaks to make the country, which requires the Serbs and Croats' active cooperation as something which is only possible by means of external coercion. Next slide, please. So turning to the future, I think there are three basic scenarios dependent as ever on the role of outsiders. A baseline scenario simply assumes more of the same, which is what will happen if the existing political deadlock continues and outside powers acquiesce to the status quo on the basis that Bosnia is simultaneously too difficult to resolve and basically tolerable for as long as the country isn't actually in a state of war. But at the same time, this also implies a continuation of the current state of dysfunctionality and stagnation as Bosniaks press for greater centralization, the Serbs and the Croats press for greater autonomy, and everything else in Bosnia's life is subordinated to these mutually irreconcilable goals. Next slide, please. There is a recovery scenario, albeit relatively unlikely, involving some kind of change in Bosnia's internal and external political arrangements. And I think the two initiatives which augur potential change are the United States push to unblock the various obstacles to the development and integration of the Balkans, starting in North Macedonia 3 years ago, where it solved the so-called name issue, now Serbia and Kosovo, and eventually to Bosnia and the vexed question of constitutional reform. And if precedent is any guide, an initiative like this could end up giving something to the Bosniaks, although it's always possible that the United States could go the other way and push for greater decentralization in recognition of the political reality on the ground. And the second initiative is the, is the American and European push to establish some kind of regional economic zone, which has the potential to recast the Balkans as a kind of EU-Yugoslavia, which could relax the Bosnian Serbs by integrating Bosnia into a larger entity with its de facto capital in Belgrade. But, and it is a huge but, all this assumes the capacity for compromise, which seems unlikely given the track record of the last 25 years. And frankly, I'm not really very optimistic. Next slide, please. And that leads to the third scenario, which is Bosnia's eventual collapse, defined by a declaration of independence by Republika Srpska and followed by some kind of assertion of independence by the Bosnian Croats. And my suspicion is that this is the most likely outcome, although it's really hard to put any kind of timeline on the events, which, as always, depend on the positions adopted by international actors, with 4 actors playing the key role in determining the outcome. Next slide, please. The most important is the United States, as it has been for the last 25 years, as the ultimate guarantor of the settlement in the Balkans. And crucially, the United States opposes any breakup of Bosnia. So from the point of view of the Bosnian Serbs, that poses a significant risk, since the United States could always punish them for making a declaration of independence from the rest of Bosnia, probably in the form of sanctions, as well as practically blocking any attempts the Serbs might make at independence. And for that reason, I don't think the Serbs are going to make any kind of break until they perceive the risks emanating from the United States to be low. At the moment, their best hope, perhaps their only hope, for securing the United States' acquiescence to Bosnia's breakup is some kind of land swap between Republika Srpska and Kosovo, which just might have been possible if Donald Trump had secured a second term in the White House by declaring independence and creating a new fact on the ground, which the United States would then be forced to deal with. But I think it's extremely unlikely that the Biden administration will accept this, meaning that any effort at a unilateral declaration of independence will have to wait until 2025 at the earliest. Next slide, please. The second relevant actor is the Europeans, who have a mixture of hard and soft power resources which they can bring to bear. But European influence over the question of Bosnia's future is limited because of their inability to utilize the powers they have. I think the chances of the Europeans physically attacking the Serbs, as they did in collaboration with the United States in 1995 and 1999, are very low. And the risk of sanctions against the Bosnian Serbs is limited by the Europeans' insistence on working through the institutions of the European Union, where there is no consensus on most matters of foreign and regional policy. And in the meantime, the EU's soft power is minimal for as long as it relies on the enticement of membership of the European Union, which doesn't appear to be happening any longer. And so I think in this respect, the Bosnian Serbs have little to lose from the Europeans. Next slide, please. The third relevant actor is Serbia, which is crucial to any bid for independence by the Bosnian Serbs, because they would subsequently rely on Serbia for their survival and prosperity. And the problem for the Bosnian Serbs for the time being is that Serbia will simply not give them the unequivocal support they need to mount a risky bid for independence, given the potential costs to Serbia itself from sanctions from the United States and an end to any residual hopes that Serbia may have of joining the European Union. I also sense that Belgrade is unclear how a bid for independence by Republika Srpska fits with its other goals of partitioning Kosovo, which requires Serbia to maintain good relations with the United States, and establishing a regional economic zone which offers a safe quasi-solution to the Serbian national question. Next slide, please. And finally, there is Croatia, which fits into the picture in two ways. Most obviously, if the Bosnian Croats are ever to break from Bosnia, they need the support of Croatia, as the Bosnian Serbs need Serbia. But the Bosnian Serbs also rely on Croatia because it's vital that if any bid for independence by Republika Srpska is going to succeed, that the Bosnian Croats simultaneously open a second front that overwhelms the Bosniaks, making a unified Bosnia impossible to defend. Next slide. And all that leads to the conclusion that if the positions of these four actors line up in the way the Bosnian Serbs want, Bosnia will collapse. But until then, I think the overwhelming likelihood is that it will remain in its current state of frozen conflict. Okay, that's where I'm going to finish. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. As previously, very interesting and provocative, with some predictions, analysis of what of perspectives. And now finally, we shall hear from our Professor Srđan Trivković. I think that he should speak also about the perspectives and of Bosnia and Herzegovina. But let's not jump into conclusions. Professor, do you hear us well?
Yes, I do. And let me start by saying that there is a touch of surreality to the discussion of Bosnia-Herzegovina as if it were a real thing, as if it were something viable and existent. In fact, the Bosnifiers of this world have never explained why the dynamics of Yugoslavia's disintegration should have stopped at the Sava River in the north and the Drina River in the east, and why the unviability of the Yugoslav project could somehow be turned into the multi-culti kumbaya of Bosnia-Herzegovina on the ruins of Yugoslavia. This is an absurdity. So, in fact, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and I'm now talking about a place where I reside at the moment. I'm speaking to you from Banja Luka. Bosnia-Herzegovina, in political terms, is Frankenstein's monster, which is kept quasi-alive by the will of the outside forces. Because left to its own devices and left to the dynamics of Yugoslavia's disintegration, it would have disintegrated a long time ago. And of course, the problem is not Serb nationalists who want to separate. It's the Muslims who want to turn this monster into a unified state in which, by virtue of their plurality, they would actually impose their will upon the others. Now, that was the root cause of the Bosnian War to start with, the attempt by Izetbegovic to overturn the Bosnian constitution of the Yugoslavia of yore into a tool of majorization. And Dayton, for all its defects, has stopped the war and kept the peace for the past 25 years. And any attempt to reunify Bosnia in terms of what Zimmerman advised Izetbegovic to try back in March of 1992 will only reignite the war. One of the principles of what in Hebrew they call tikkun, putting the word right, repairing the world, is not doing the harm. And any attempt to try and overturn the Dayton model in favor of Bosnification is only going to result in not only reigniting the conflict from '92, but also making it even worse, because let's face it, at the moment, we have a whole generation of Serbs, Bosniaks, and Croats within the boundaries of Bosnia-Herzegovina who do not want to be ruled by the members of the other group. And that's why I do not agree with the notion that the mentality of people in Bosnia-Herzegovina somehow transcends their internal differences. Those differences are even deeper today than they were in '92. And so if we cannot put Humpty Dumpty together again in terms of Yugoslavia from Slovenia, from the Triglav Mountains to the Vardar River in Macedonia, then I don't know where does this strange obsession with keeping Bosnia together come. It is indeed an obsession, and it is indeed an obsession not based upon reality on the ground, but upon some kind of ideological notion that, okay, if the Yugoslav dream couldn't work, at least we had to make Bosnia work. And by golly, we'll make it work by hook or by crook. And the people on the ground don't want it. The people on the ground, the Serbs of Bosnia-Herzegovina, in Republika Srpska, certainly don't want to be Bosnified. They support Serbia when, in fact, it's funny that the only people supporting the Bosnia-Herzegovina team when it plays against others are the Bosniaks, certainly not the Croats. It's just one little banal example. But to come to the serious question of the future, if there is no dynamics for a polity to have the centripetal dynamics of its long-term sustainability and the sense of its people belonging to different communities of a common destiny, then why insist on its staying together? Or at least, if it stays together as an internationally recognized entity, why insisting on the change of internal arrangements to reflect the interests of one party against the others? There will be no referendum in the Republika Srpska unless there is a push to re-centralize and reunify Bosnia in the name of some transcendent Bosnian identity, which doesn't exist, never has existed, and never will exist. So I will actually not use all of my time. I only wanted to make these key points because what has been missing so far is the recognition of the reality that Bosnia used to be and has always been the Yugoslav microcosm, and that the same dynamics of Yugoslav disintegration have fatally affected Bosnia, that Dayton has kept it together in whatever ramshackle way, and that any attempt to make Bosnia quote unquote functional really means for the Serbs and Croats a red flag to make Bosnia Bosnified, and they will never allow that.
Thank you, Srđan, very much. So I see at the chat bar that the discussion is already going on. We have a few questions, so please, if you want to ask the question, put it at the chat bar aside, and I will read them, at least those questions that refer to the current topic. So we had some comments, some exchanges of opinions, and if I may see, the first one was colleague Mihailo Vučić. So Mihailo, you can ask your question, because I'm not sure if everybody is able now to scroll, the chat and see what was your question. So Mihailo, are you with us? Dr. Vučić Mihailo? Well, if he's not hearing me well at the moment, we can proceed with our colleague Danilo Babić. Danilo, please unmute yourself. And,
okay. So I'm gonna repeat my question. So my question is referred to the presentation of Mr. Galbрајt. So how come the U.S. public opinion was so horrified with the siege of Sarajevo, and yet they were completely indifferent to the ethnic cleansing of Serbs from Croatia in the Operation Storm? As we can see, Mr. Galbрајt said it was sanctioned by the USA, so it was allowed by the USA. So can you explain the difference? And just one small comment. I disagree that the United States didn't have any strategic interest. I believe that the dissolution of Yugoslavia was the strategic interest of the United States, because it was a relatively expensive toy that was no longer needed because the Soviet Union collapsed. Thank you very much.
Okay, if we have Mihailo now, he could also ask the question. If not, we shall hear from, yes, we have also Mr. Trapara. Dr. Trapara, are you willing to say publicly your comment or question? regarding the intervention of Ambassador Галбрајт. Okay. Well, Ambassador Галбрајt, please, you can reply to what Danilo asked you, colleague Danilo Babic.
Well, I mean, there were many differences between what happened in Krajina and what happened in Sarajevo. The shelling of Sarajevo was something that took place over a longer period of time than the Nazi siege of Leningrad. It was a much larger population, many more deaths. It took place in the context of the ethnic cleansing in Eastern Bosnia, Visegrad, and also in places like Kozarac and Prijedor, the camps in Prijedor. Whereas the Krajina operation, which, as some may know, I did try actually to find a political settlement, even at the last minute, was significantly the result of the fact that the Krajina Serbs refused to negotiate, that they had launched military operations across the international border into Bihać along with the Bosnian Serbs. And so, people were afraid that if Ratko Mladić took Bihać, which had 4 times the population of Srebrenica, and did what he did in Bihać, did the same thing as Srebrenica, we would have had, multiply 7,000 times 4, 28,000. So I think the differences were very, very significant. After Operation Storm, Franjo Tuđman said that the people who left were optanci, they couldn't come back. And we spent a lot of time, as a major part of my effort as representing the United States, to say, no, everybody who left Croatia is a Croatian citizen and they're entitled to come back. And then we prevented another military operation in Eastern Slavonia by negotiating the Erdut agreement. I think one of the problems in this situation is you're always faced with very, very difficult choices. What was our choice on Krajina? Do we accept that the Croatians move militarily, knowing that the population will leave, knowing that probably stragglers will be killed as they were? Or do we allow Ratko Mladić to perpetrate a Srebrenica and Bihać? And there was no reason to think that that wouldn't happen. That was if we had a magic wand, for sure, we wouldn't have, we would have said, we'll have a political settlement. We would have said, take the Z4 plan, which involved huge autonomy. But, that wasn't on the table. I wanted also to say, I put this in the chat. People wonder, what is the commitment to Bosnia? Why the Bosnia files? And I think you can debate whether it's a good idea, whether what I'm saying is how people should look at it, but I can describe how people do look at it, and then, fine. The perspective on Bosnia has to do with what happened during the war. Again, the shelling of Sarajevo, Srebrenica, the ethnic cleansings in 1992. And so it's very difficult for US policymakers, and in particular, President-elect Joe Biden, who went to Sarajevo in April 1993 during the worst days of the siege, who was, and I worked with him, he was on the Foreign Relations Committee before I became ambassador, who was very, very concerned, very focused on the humanitarian issues, on the atrocities. And so it's impossible for me to believe that he would agree to any kind of partition of Bosnia, because he would see that, as frankly do I, rewarding the people who engaged in ethnic cleansing, or as some people say, genocide. And somehow if you could go back and say, okay, all those people in Eastern Bosnia get to go back there, and the population goes back to 1991, that map you showed, well, maybe it would be different. But we know that isn't going to happen. So, interestingly, much of my career has been in countries that broke up. not just Yugoslavia, but East Timor. Spent a lot of time in Iraqi Kurdistan. And I'm strongly of the view that where people in a geographic space want to have their own state, they ought to have it. You know, I'd apply that same point to Scotland, which I think is likely to happen. But if they got the majority by killing other people, then you can't reward that. And at least that is how a generation that went through the war see the situation in Bosnia. You can argue that we're wrong, but I'm just saying that's how we see it.
Okay, well, some things that we say maybe to put it mildly overstatement, as have multiple witnesses of different scenario. But now I think that Professor Trivković argued.
I think we cannot take seriously.
And after Professor Trivković, we should hear from Mihailo, because we did not hear of him after that.
I think we cannot take seriously any statements concerning alleged atrocities, let alone, quote, genocide, unquote, from a person who stated at the Hague Tribunal that what happened in Ukraine during Operation Storm was not ethnic cleansing. So we have situational moralists par excellence, because whether something is ethnic cleansing or not does not depend upon the act itself, but upon who is perpetrating it and who are the victims. Therefore, I think that the person who said at the Hague that the Krajina was not ethnic cleansing is not deserving of making any pronouncement about any other ethnic cleansing anywhere. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Mihailo Vučić doesn't want to comment anymore, and we hear from Dr. Les, please. He wanted to say something. You should unmute. Okay, now we can. I think that you, sorry, Dr. Les.
Yes, I just wanted to embellish Ambassador Galbraith's comments in answer to the question, why does the West insist on maintaining Bosnia as a unified state? And I certainly agree that one of the key factors is this aversion to rewarding, as it would seem, the Serbs for their campaign of ethnic cleansing during the war. But I think there are three other factors which come to bear on this. Above all is the risk of conflict if Republika Srpska is allowed to secede. Certainly from my time working in the British Foreign Office, we worked on the assumption that a bid for secession by the Bosnian Serbs would be followed by an attempt by the Bosniaks to retain the Republika Srpska as part of Bosnia, for which the natural consequence is some kind of conflict, which we didn't want and potentially couldn't control. And so in that sense, the whole business had to be contained simply by prohibiting any attempt by Republika Srpska to edge away from the center. I think a second factor is that certainly within Europe, and I suspect this is the case in the United States as well, there is an assumption among policymakers that we've transcended the era of nation states. Certainly all countries that are participating in the European Union are participating in a project which seeks to promote multi-ethnicity and multilateral governance as a solution to the problems of nationalism, which are perceived to have caused war in the 20th century. Whether that's true or not, that is the assumption. And I think the third factor which comes to bear is that the Europeans think they have a solution for Bosnia, which should satisfy the Serbs and the Croats, namely its integration into the European Union, which offers a kind of quasi-solution to the Serbian national question by allowing the Bosnian Serbs to reunite with Serbia inside a borderless European Union. And in that sense, while they think that this option still exists and it is viable and the Bosnian Serbs should accept it and perhaps will accept it, there's no need to countenance the much riskier option of Bosnia's breakup with all the implications for violence that could follow from that. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you. We are having a Rajko, but he wanted to ask something regarding the Brčko district. So,
thank you, Slobodan. Do you hear me?
Yes. Please present yourself.
Rajko Petrović from Institute of European Studies, and I'm also born and lived in Bosnia, in Zvornik. I have a question about Brčko district. How important was the future status of Brčko during the negotiations process in Daytona 1995? Thank you.
I guess.
Yes, okay.
I guess it falls on me since I was there. It was extremely important. It was the last issue at Dayton. And in fact, on the night of November 20th, it looked like there wouldn't be an agreement. In fact, on the morning of the 21st, we had a discussion among our own delegation. Holbrooke wanted to have a partial agreement, which Christopher objected to. And then Milosevic shows up, knocks on the door, and proposes the arrangement on Brčko. So that was pretty clear. I'm sorry if I can't left unchallenged a couple of these statements. First, I was trying to explain why they're Bosniophiles. Although I certainly agree that all the other factors are why nobody wants to have Bosnia break up. But the attachment to Bosnia, I think, is explained that way. And finally, I'm really sorry that we are, 25 years later, relitigating, issues of ethnic cleansing and that sort of thing. I guess I can explain what I said at the Hague Tribunal. By time the Croatian forces got into the Krajina, the population had already left. So that is logically different from what happens if you go in and you expel people, which is what happened in actually the Krajina in '91 and in Bosnia, especially you expel them with great brutality. That was the distinction I was trying to make. But we absolutely focused on war crimes committed by the Croatians. And in fact, I testified in 2 trials, the one of Gotovina and the one of Perlach, Praljak and all. So, we were not endorsing it, and we certainly knew, and we spent a lot of time going around documenting what had happened. So even though most of the population had led, there was Tudjman allowed the unchecked burning of Serb homes and the murder of a few hundred, mostly old people who had stayed behind. And in my view, those were war crimes. But I don't know that there's any point in relitigating all these issues for 25 years later. I've simply tried to explain the history of it, and I think it's certainly time to move on. I will note that Ratko Mladic was convicted of genocide by an international tribunal, as well as multiple other crimes.
There are definitely
I find it very curious that we should move on from events 25 years ago, while from Timothy Less we heard only 5 minutes ago that events from 25 years ago should determine the future. So which should it be? If the ethnic cleansing in Ukraine was not ethnic cleansing, then we should look forward and not look back. But if the massacres in eastern Bosnia were genocide, and therefore put a permanent mark on the Serbs as undeserving of the status that the Bosniaks have, then it's one or the other. Should we still be framed in by the events of 92 to 95, or should we look forward? it seems to me that some participants in this debate say, when it comes to the Serbs, the mark of Cain stays forever, and they should shut up and slunk into their third of Bosnia, whatever. But when it comes to the others, then of course we shall hold hands and march to the European future. Let's be realistic. I've been to Brussels long enough to know that there will be no extension of the European Union, that there is no political will to receive any of the former Yugoslav republics which are not there already, meaning Slovenia and Croatia, and that the whole concept of march to Europe has been spent for all of the former Yugoslavs left behind. There is no extension, there is no political will for it, primarily in Benelux, Brussels, in Berlin and in Paris, and it will not happen. And the notion that transcending ethnic divides through the mechanisms of the Brussels bureaucracy is the way forward is science fiction. It's non-existent, it's not an option.
Thank you. Well, I just wanted to say there are definitely facts, and there are the ways people see these facts and try to present them. But as I see, and as we all can see, we cannot move everybody takes its own position, and it will be only in some tribunal or in a place where we can present some facts that we underpinned with evidences that we can continue in this way. But we have now a question of our colleague Sandra Davidovic. Sandra, please unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Please present yourself and then ask the question or have a comment.
Okay, thank you, Slobodan. My name is Sandra, as Slobodan said, and I'm a research assistant at the Institute of International Politics and Economics here in Belgrade. And I would like to thank all of the speakers for sharing their thoughts on the agreement. I think I have two remarks or questions, if I may say that way. The first one is related to the presentation of Professor Les, and I'm asking this as a young researcher interested in post-conflict studies primarily. He mentioned that, let's say, widely spread mantra that the Dayton Agreement has never been perceived as an agreement aimed to create framework for state building, but primarily to end up the war in Bosnia. However, on the other hand, we know from the agreement that the civilian annex comprised of 5/6, let's say 5/6 of the agreement in its when it comes to its content. So my question would be about the accountability of the implementation of the agreement. It is obvious that it lacked certain, it lacked success, especially when it comes to the transition from international to local level of government. But having in mind the state building agenda in Bosnia, what do you perceive as the major problem in implementing the agreement itself when it comes to state building part? I'm not speaking here about peace building, which I think, by the way, that is quite a decent achievement in terms of this agreement. And the other question would be for Ambassador, for the respected Ambassador Galbрајt, regarding his remark on the absence of strategic interests of the United States. I do agree to some extent with his perspective, and but still I'm in a way confused by the historical fact that the early recognition of those republics in a way instigated war and maybe in a way extended the war itself. However, on the other hand, we could witness that we could witness the absence of military engagement of the United States in a war. So how could you explain that contradictory when it comes to Bosnia? And thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. So we have eventually one more question, and we can put them all together. The last one was Ivan, but Ivan, do you have a question related to our topic? Because we are here discussing the situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina, not in the United Kingdom. Ivan, do you hear me, please? Ivan Dujic. Okay. If not, we have a colleague, Vlada, Dr. Rusиć, who wanted to ask a question previously. Sorry.
Thank you. Oh, I unmuted myself. Okay, thank you. I will just ask one short question as a matter of my personal curiosity, and probably some other participants would share my curiosity. This question is basically both to Mr. Galbрајт and Mr. Les, because they are from the Western countries. My question is like a little bit going into the history in terms of when the Yugoslavia was breaking up, and basically which also affects Bosnia, which is our topic today, before recognition of the republics in the communist borders. Basically, my question is from the Western countries' perception. Would it be more sustainable and more logical than basically principles of breakup of Yugoslavia was actually the same principles of the forming Yugoslavia, but of course with the opposite direction, which means before the results of the Second World War and basically killing of the people in Yugoslavia, and plus before the communist borders, meaning using the principles of American President Woodrow Wilson, and using the principles which were before communism in Yugoslavia. Why I'm asking that? Because somehow I thought that the Western civilizations are basically very reluctant to recognize any products of the communism, and basically that Western democracies like democracy. Me personally also always like to reset things into the time before the communism, because we cannot compare pluralistic democracy versus communist dictatorship. Although it was soft Tito's dictatorship, but it was still dictatorship. So my question is, while making some big peace conference, or while thinking about the big peace conference before dissolution of Yugoslavia, wouldn't it be better that I don't know, 100 scientists sit together from the whole world, sit together, consider the Woodrow Wilson principles, consider the municipal borders, which was before basically drawing by the communist regime by actually one man, and then try to make arrangement which would be based on pre-communist period. Just a small note connected to Bosnia, just a small interesting symbol. Second access to sea, or access to sea by Republika Srpska, for example, if we go to the pre-war Bosnian borders, would be Sutorina. Sutorina is a small place next to Kotor Bay. So, we witnessed a couple of years ago that there was some movement, very interesting, but it was supported by the central authority in Sarajevo and also by some Bosniak intellectuals, of course with Serbs intellectuals, that Republika Srpska should get access to sea using that principle of the fact that Sutorina, small village on the Adriatic coast, belonged before to Trebinje municipality, which is southeast municipality of Republika Srpska. So I don't expect a long answer to this, but just as the matter of principles, like curiosity, how come Western countries easily followed results of the communist setup instead of looking for something which was 5 minutes before the communist regime took place in former Yugoslavia? Thank you.
Thank you. And I myself will ask one question. And we have one more comment after me, colleague Zdravković, and I think that will be enough. After we shall hear also the answers. So my question is for Professor Trivković. What do you expect if Biden becomes president? Because we have this European EU analysis that this will somehow give a more weight to the Bosnian Muslim side in Bosnia and their conception of the future Bosnia and Herzegovina, how it will be rearranged, reformed, and how do you see the role of other important factors like Russia and Turkey as well? And after now we can hear the comment from Ms. Zdravković, and finally pass to your answers and questions for our speakers. Slađana, can you unmute?
Of course. Can you hear me all?
Yes, please present yourself and.
All right. My name is Slađana Zdravković. I'm coming from Institute of European Studies, and I have a question. I don't have a question. I have a short comment on Ambassador Peter Galbрајt testifying, the statement given today. I don't want to offend anybody, especially our guests, because given that you are our guests, maybe I'm obviously biased given that I am from Serbia, but I didn't like some facts that you exposed. For example, you don't know our mentality. I don't quite find interesting the fact that Milošević was drinking wine, and the alcohol has a big influence in the politics in Balkan. You know, we have the situation, if you know our history in Balkan, every political agreement is usually taking place in that kind of in the bars, in that kind we call it kafana. Now my brain stopped working to translate the word kafana, but that is not unusual if you knew our mentality. That they have met over there, and I don't know how this fact of Milošević drinking wine is helping us today when we are discussing Dayton agreement. Also, I'm certain that the USA doesn't want to open the question of Dayton agreement given the situation that it has it at home, and given the situation that we have in as you can see, we can compare it with Nagorno-Karabakh and the involvement of Turkey and Russia in that area. So even if I certainly agree that Dayton Agreement made an Frankenstein and experimental state, and that no sides are happy about it. I have friends over there, both Croats, both Bosniaks, and I agree with
Slađana, excuse me, but okay, what we like or dislike is another issue. So here we should focus on analysis, arguments, perspectives. So, sorry.
No, I just want to say one thing. I don't like always stating that Serbia is always the guilty side, the guilty state. It's always Serbs.
Okay, we heard you. And Marina wanted to ask something, but this refers, I think, to the diplomatic career of Mr. Galbрајt. I'm not sure if this is really a part of our. You wanted to ask something else, maybe?
Go ahead. I don't mind.
Okay.
Relations in Bosnia.
Yeah, Marina, please present yourself and.
Okay, my name is Marina Kostić. I'm a research fellow in the Institute of International Politics and Economics. My question referred to the influence of some other actors, for example, Russia, during the negotiations. So 1992, 1993, were there any influences to frame some result at the end from the third countries, or it was exclusively between West and the Bosnian and other post-Yugoslav countries? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think that was all. We can start maybe with Professor Galbрајt, because I think you had most of the questions. I'm not sure. Is it okay with you?
It's certainly fine with me.
Thank you.
First, on the question of the strategic interest, I think it's worth noting that the United States was not one of the countries that recognized Croatia and Slovenia and Bosnia early. This was a European Union decision. The Germans on December 15th, the European Union of 1991 of Croatia and Slovenia, the European community, I guess, because it wasn't yet the EU, on January 15th. And the United States didn't, in 1992, the United States didn't recognize until April of 1992. And, you know, we had to make some decision because they were applying for the UN and so on. Secondly, there was the Badentor Commission, which basically laid out criteria, the European Union Commission, French lawyer, Robert Badentor, that states had to meet to qualify for recognition, and those included referenda, and obviously included the referendum that took place in Bosnia. Now, turning to the question, the big question about self-determination, and the borders, and why the international community, and actually here, it was the Europeans who took the lead. The US didn't really get that involved until the Clinton administration in January of 1993. But why these borders? Well, for the pretty obvious reason, if you opened up the borders, you were going to open up endless conflict. And remember, this was occurring at the same time. In fact, the Declaration of Independence of Croatia and Slovenia was June 25th, 1991. The Soviet Union broke up that September through December. So, you know, the last thing that anybody wanted, and I think the Americans and the Europeans were entirely on the same side on this, was to then try to open up the borders. I mean, should Crimea go to Ukraine? You know, what about Transnistria? I mean, it was and in fact, it has become a significant can of worms. But that was what we were all trying to avoid. Now, in the course of the negotiations, and David Owen was an architect of this, and I personally disagreed with it very much. And this had to do with the Croatia peace negotiations, the Z4 plan, really, and its connection to Bosnia. David Owen, who blocked the presentation of the Z4 plan over this for a long time, and I think reduced significantly the chances of its success, he was talking about border exchanges, specifically that Gunja, which is north of the Sava, would be ceded to Bosnia, but to Srpska, so that the Bosnian Federation would have Brčko. And so that's how you would get the connection. There was also early discussion about, in fact, Tudjman often raised this with me. He said, well, you know, we can give up Prevlaka. And at one point there was even discussion of Molinata, which is, you know, a town on, south of Dubrovnik, north of Prevlaka. You know, maybe that could be access to the sea for the Republika Srpska. You know, and again, acting on instructions, although in some way I generated my own instructions. we, the United States, strongly opposed that because we didn't want to open up the issue of changing borders. Tudjman's other fantasy, and I don't know how happy you would be in Serbia with this, was that, okay, Serbia can have Baranja, but we want to extend Croatia back to what the Banovina was, I guess, into Eastern Srem. So it would have been on the other side of the Danube. He constantly talked about this, and we constantly said no. When one of the comments said I didn't answer about Britschko. I thought I did, but I want to be very clear. It was the last issue. The peace negotiations were not going to be concluded on the morning of November 21st because the Bosnian, there was no agreement about Britschko. The Bosnians insisted that Britschko should be part of the federation. And Milosevic came and proposed this compromise, which involved international administration of Britschko. And that was the key issue. I hope that then made it possible to get to Dayton. And I think you can understand, well, I mean, one of the issues about Milosevic is he didn't care about a lot of these issues. You know, he was not a Bosnian Serb. So, you know, he was happy to give up on issues that they thought were important. He rather casually gave up on Sarajevo. He totally abandoned the Krajina. I went to Belgrade on the day before Operation Storm, I think it's August 3rd, and met with Babic. And we reached an agreement that if it had been implemented, might have headed off Operation Storm. But it required Milosevic's endorsement, and he would not see the charge Rudy Perina to endorse it. It's a complicated history there. On the issue of alcohol, of course, I know that alcohol is part of the culture in the region, and you know, and I'm not a teetotaler, but I think there is a difference between arriving at a meeting when you've already drunk a lot with the American Secretary of State and with the Croatian president, and then in the course of an hour to drink a bottle and a half of wine. You know, that's a liter of wine. You know, that's a little different from celebrating things with alcohol or having a drink at lunch. And this was behavior that was repeatedly observed by other diplomats. Anyhow, I didn't share that to, my contribution here, I'm not trying to relitigate things 25 years ago. I'm just trying to help improve the understanding of what went on. And, you know, I'm telling you my story. Other people will have different versions of it. I could say that when talking about, you know, again, looking at these issues case by case, when we were preparing the map for the Z4 plan, which we never presented, we went to the city of Sloon, which was a Croat majority. We were using the 91 census. We went literally street by street as to who lived, were they Croats or Serbs, as to draw the boundaries of what would have been the autonomous region. Certainly my view is that what was on offer was quite extraordinary, and the people who refused to accept it did great damage. You know, and finally, on the issue of Russia, so Sergei Lavrov was part of the contact group, and he was, I guess he was deputy Russian foreign minister then. And so he was in Dayton. I don't think, and I'm afraid I will offend perhaps my European friends, but my feeling is that the Europeans did not have a big role in what was happening in Dayton. They were there. There was certainly some resentment of being shut out. But on the Z4 plan, the Russian ambassador to Croatia, a guy named Leonid Kiristidians, he was my partner in this. And he spent a lot of time trying to persuade Milan Martic to accept to agree to negotiate about the proposal. He literally wouldn't pick it up. And then after Operation Storm, he said to me, you know, I was going to include him in the negotiations leading to Erdut because we had such a good partnership. And he said, look, I'm going to step back because this really is something that has to be done by the United States at that point in time. To me, it was a really significant thing because most diplomats, perhaps like most of you always want to be part of the action. So anyhow, I hope I've answered all the questions.
In response to Sloba's question about the future, we already had an attempt by Joe Biden in 2009 when he was vice president to come to the Balkans and to kickstart something that came to be known as the Butmir process. In fact, the Butmir process was a misnomer because there was no process. It was supposed to be some kind of political movement in the direction of greater unitarization of Bosnia, and it simply didn't happen and couldn't happen. In fact, the only way it could happen is by brute force. And I don't think that the Biden administration will have the wherewithal or the political will to reapply brute force the way that they did in the 1990s, when part of the US political culture was a blowjob on the president in the Oval Cabinet, which is something less of a sin, I suppose, than drinking a liter of wine over a late lunch. So I think that there will be a lot of huffing and puffing from some of Biden's advisors. I think there will be people like Tony Blinken and Michelle Flournoy and Nick Burns, who, and of course, the genocide chick herself, Samantha Power, if she makes reappearance in some shape and form. But there will be more serious fish to fry. The Biden administration will be committed to a new leaf with China. They are talking about rearming Ukraine with lethal weapons. They're talking about putting regime change, pardon me, democracy promotion at the center of their foreign policy. And all in all, I think that the Balkans really isn't important enough to be the testing ground of the will of the incoming administration, because the difficulties are not worth the effort. As Bismarck had said, all of the Balkans is not worth the healthy bones of a Pommern grenadier. And had the Kaiser followed that advice after dismissing the Iron Chancellor, the history of Europe would have looked better than it is today.
Slobodan, you're muted. You're muted, Slobodan.
Sorry. Yeah. Thank you, Professor Trivković again. And finally, we'll hear from our colleague, Dr. Les. And I think it will be more than enough, because as we are more than 2 hours already here. Topic is, of course, very interesting. The debate was very interesting, but we should hear also some more now. Dr. Les, please.
Thank you. There were so many questions. With respect to the second, I think about the reasons for creating Yugoslavia, I have very little to add to what Ambassador Galbraith has already said. Suffice to say, the whole Western response was a big improvisation. It was reactive, generated by events on the ground. And I don't believe there was a point where policymakers were stepping back and thinking in simply strategic terms, because it wasn't within our gift to determine outcomes in the former Yugoslavia in this way, when the facts on the ground were changing so fast. On the question of state building, this is a hugely contested area in the literature, but my simple answer to the question, why has state building failed, is that outside powers interpreted state building as strengthening the central institutions, and this was rejected by the Serbs in particular, but also by the Croats. And it was only possible while outsiders were exerting coercion on those two groups to cede powers to the center. But as soon as outsiders relaxed their grip, the state building project failed for a lack of consent on the part of the two groups who were being asked to cede powers to what they saw as an illegitimate source of authority in Sarajevo. Finally, on the question of Joe Biden, I think this is really crucial for an understanding of where Bosnia is heading in the future. I've just written a piece on this for the Serbian Media Center, so this is rather fresh in my mind. But the short answer is I think the United States is going to make a push for establishing a regional economic zone in the Western Balkans, which applies the logic which the great powers originally brought to bear in 1920 when they established Yugoslavia, namely to gather up this disparate group of peoples who had emerged from the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and then instantly began fighting with each other with the aim of establishing nation states. And in 1920, the determination was that the way to promote stability in that particular corner of Europe was to gather all these groups up in a single entity, which eroded the need for borders between them. And I think the Biden administration is going to be forced into adopting a similar kind of logic because there simply aren't any other options left. Going back to the beginning of this century, I think, at least in theory, the Europeans had 5 options which they could have taken. One was to maintain the Balkans as a series of international protectorates enforced by their militaries, but there was really no appetite for that. A second option was to redraw borders and establish nation states, but for reasons we've already discussed, there was no enthusiasm for that option either. That left 2 options which were actively considered. One was to incorporate the Balkans immediately into the European Union, thereby overcoming this problem of mismatched borders. But that was rejected because of the fear that it would destabilize the EU itself, leading to the 4th option, which was to subject the region to the kind of conditions-based integration process that Central Europe had gone through. But for reasons we touched on, I think that policy is no longer really viable, which really only leaves one option left, which is the logic of Yugoslavia. I'm not suggesting that the America is going to promote a new Yugoslavia, but it's going to deploy this logic towards the establishment of some kind of economic zone in which the different countries in the region dismantle their border infrastructure and entitle citizens of neighboring countries to live and work freely in their own. And I think when the Biden administration takes a good hard look at what it wants to achieve in the Balkans and what its options are, it will see that the European Union is now tacitly abandoning the process of enlargement in favor of an economic zone, all pursued under this so-called Berlin process, that Serbia is on board with this for its own particular geostrategic reasons, and that most of the other countries in the Western Balkans, Albania, North Macedonia, now Kosovo is coming on board, and that this is really the only viable option left once all the other options have been eliminated. And I think from the Biden administration's point of view, they'll see it not as a perfect solution, but something which allows life to go on in the region, keeps Russia and China and Turkey at bay, and by anchoring this regional economic zone to the European Union, restores the position it was hoping to achieve in the middle of the 2000s, which was namely to offload the problem of the Balkans onto the Europeans in a way that frees the United States of further obligations in the region.
Thank you. Thank you all. Yeah, we will have only one more short intervention by Dr. Rusиć, and then we will conclude this very interesting webinar. You presented the different perspectives for Bosnia and Herzegovina and for the Balkans, especially for the post-Yugoslav area. And of course, there are different opinions, and that is normal, different analysis. I myself don't agree with everything heard because we had already Yugoslavia and failed twice, and I don't see how it will somehow be something good, more free. But anyway, Mr. Rusиć, yes, please.
Yes, thank you. Sorry for taking a flow again. I just wanted to clarify what I thought. First of all, thanks to Mr. Galbрајт and Mr. Les for the answer, and just to clarify what I had in mind when I challenged basically Tito's Borges versus Borges before. Actually, I mentioned I was not clear enough. I mentioned that it could be maybe drilled down to the municipal level. What I wanted to say, not like big disturbances, as Mr. Galbрајt says, like Baranja versus Eastern Srem or something like that, but more like concept of Italy. When Italy got South Tyrol, basically they got it. No one challenged international recognized borders, but somehow they agreed to keep territory of Tyrol not merged to Venetia region or something like that, but to keep specificness of that territory within their own states. What I wanted to say is, like, because I know that Mr. Galbрајt was promoter of Z4 plan, which I like also, and then basically to make some fine-tuning balance and say, okay, international recognized borders are international recognized borders, but please use the Italian concept of South Tyrol and try to accommodate your minorities within your state using some already checked and used traditional inner municipal county borders. That was my point when I mentioned those small fine tuning of the municipal borders within already recognized states, which probably could help in decreasing ethnic tensions, and which probably could maybe not could stop the war, but probably could make war less tragic and less, how to say, with less victims. And I don't know, I'm just guessing now, but in that terms, like to find nice combination between principle of international recognized borders, okay, fine, but within all newly recognized republics of former Yugoslavia, let's try to do fine tuning of the municipalities in a way that it look like Italy and the South Tyrol within Italy. Thank you.
Thank you again, then thank you all, and it was a pleasure again, and hope to see you again in some other occasion. Also after all this frantics with the new coronavirus, and hope to meet you also in person. So bye everybody, and thank you for participating.